We have breaking news right now. Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, has officially deployed the military to Portland, Oregon, just one day after Donald Trump says that he wanted military boots on the ground to use, quote, full force against American citizens in Portland, Oregon. Minutes ago, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth issued a memorandum for the Adjutant General, the Oregon National Guard, through the Governor of Oregon, with the subject line calling members of the Oregon National Guard into federal service. On June 7th, 2025, the President of the United States called forth at least 2,000 National Guard personnel into federal service to Section 12406 of Title 10 United States Code to protect U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement and other U.S. government personnel who are performing federal functions, including the enforcement of federal law, and to protect federal property at locations where protests against these functions are occurring or are likely to occur based on current threat assessments and planned operations. The President signed a copy of the attached memorandum to effectuate the calling forth of these service members. This memorandum further implements the President's direction. 200 members of the Oregon National Guard will be called into federal service effective immediately for a period of 60 days. The Chief of the National Guard Bureau will immediately coordinate the details of the mobilization with you in coordination with the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Commander, U.S. Northern Command. The mobilized service members will be under the command and control of the Commander of the U.S. Northern Command. It is official. There will be troops on the ground. Now, this mobilization is just National Guard. It does not include active U.S. military duty personnel. However, that may be coming soon. If you remember back in Los Angeles, a number of Navy personnel or Marine personnel were nearby at a Marine base, and some were even deployed on the ground during the protest in Los Angeles. Now, following this memorandum, the Oregon Attorney General immediately sued the Trump administration, saying that they, quote, infringed on Oregon's sovereign power to manage its own law enforcement activities, and that by doing so, threatened to undermine public safety by inciting a public outcry. Oregon went on to say that doing so is patently unlawful and violates the 10th Amendment of the United States Constitution, holding back no punches. Quote, if Democrats' true aim were to protect jurisdictions that are ravaged and under siege by criminal activity, they would have deployed the military to any of the many jurisdictions where violent crime rates are higher. The use of federalized troops to engage in domestic law enforcement without the state's consent threatens an irreparable injury to the state's sovereign interest in managing its own law enforcement activities. This lawsuit has been filed. And it comes just one day after Donald Trump essentially authorized the United States military to use, quote, full force against American civilians. If you recall, he put out a Truth Social post where he said, quote, at the request of Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, I'm directing Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, to provide all necessary troops to protect war-ravaged Portland and any of our ICE facilities under siege from attack by Antifa and other domestic terrorists. I am also authorizing full force if necessary. Thank you for your attention to this matter. After Donald Trump put out that post, there was mass confusion within the Pentagon. Why? Because the term full force is not one that is typically used within the Department of Defense. It's one that military personnel had no idea what it meant. And truth be told, even with this National Guard deployment tonight, Donald Trump and the National Guard cannot conduct law enforcement activities unless and until the President of the United States makes the extraordinary decision to invoke the Insurrection Act to then allow these National Guardsmen to conduct law enforcement activities. He has not done so. And until and unless he does that, the National Guard cannot do things like arrest individuals. But what the National Guard can do is limited to protecting federal property. So for example, the ICE facility in downtown Portland, that is something that you may see National Guard troops around. But if you recall, yesterday, I showed you all a video from Senator Ron Wyden. He's Oregon senator. And he essentially put out a video where he was at the ICE facility, and it showed that it was peaceful, relatively peaceful. Now, overnight, there were protests outside of Portland's ICE facility, and because residents are pushing back. But today, according to local KPTV, there was little activity outside of the facility. And so we'll see what happens next. But here's something that not many media outlets are actually reporting, because what's interesting is this decision was predated by the city of Portland issuing a land use violation notice for the ICE facility. Essentially, earlier this month, on September 17th, the city of Portland believed that conditions for the federal government violated detention conditions of its land use approval 25 times in a 10-month period. The city of Portland sent a land use violation notice to ICE, the facility in Southwest Portland, launching a process to determine whether or not the site's detention practices comply with the conditions of the site's land use approval. Federal government records from a 10-month period showed that more than 24 detention policies, violations of the facility's land use conditions of approval with the city, which does not allow detainees to be kept overnight or held for more than 12 hours. Essentially, the city had these policies in place where ICE facilities cannot mistreat detainees, and yet there were at least 10 violations. And as a result, essentially, they began the process of potentially revoking ICE's ability to have the facility in Portland. Now, back in 2011, a conditional land use approval began in place. And according to there was a long-term lease with the GSA for 2 agencies associated with ICE. It includes a processing center where federal officers detain and interview people to determine their legal status as U.S. residents. And records indicate that detainees, this is from the city of Portland, were held beyond the facility's 12-hour limit or kept overnight 25 times between October 1st, 2024 and July 27, 2025. And the most recent violation occurred earlier this year in May 20th. Under land use permitting rules, a landowner or operator has 30 days after receiving a notice or violation to correct the issue. A fine can be issued if there's substantial evidence of a violation, and Portland Permitting and Development can initiate a, quote, reconsideration of a land use approval by scheduling a hearing 60 days after the notice. They were going to pull ICE's ability to have a facility on that land. And just 1 week later, they're sending in the National Guard into Portland, saying that this ICE facility is now under attack. But there is no evidence that it's under attack. Let that sink in for a second. That's something that many people are not talking about and many people need to know about. So spread the word, subscribe to support, like, comment, share. See you soon.